I signed the contract in my own blood. Clause 4. I am strictly a breeder. Clause 5. No claiming mark. I sold myself to the war beast. It was the only way to keep my blind brother hidden in the mountains. That was the absolute law of our arrangement. Then my abuser's severed arm hits the oak floorboards. A heavy, wet thud. The great hall goes completely dead. The sharp stench of copper catches in the back of my throat. The sovereign doesn't even look at the ruined peace treaty near his boots. He is covered in the slaughter. His chest heaves as he drops to his knees. 1,000 soldiers stand completely paralyzed in the shadows. He looks up at me. His jaw tightens. Bare your throat. Tessa hauled the heavy cage door shut. Iron struck iron. The sound cracked across the grey wasteland, leaving a hollow echo in its wake. She let go of the bars. The freezing metal peeled away from her raw fingers, leaving the skin stinging. She was locked inside. Wind whipped loose hair across her face. Tessa dug a hand into her pocket until she found the frayed strip of grey cloth, Rowan's old blindfold. She squeezed the rough linen, using the coarse texture to ground her racing mind. The wind died down. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own uneven breathing. She pressed her spine against the rusted bars and slid down to the frozen dirt. Giving herself to a warlord was madness. Trusting him to keep a bargain was worse. But the alternative was Garrick. Just 2 days ago, she dragged Rowan out of a damp cave that smelled like old copper. Garrick's men had marked her blind brother as a blood-tithe, a rare sacrifice meant to seal a dark pact. She had run until her soles bled, pulling him into the night. But Garrick never stopped hunting, what he considered his. The cold seeped through the soles of her boots. She locked her arms around her ribs, listening to the rapid clicking of her own teeth. Her eyes stayed dry. She didn't have the energy for tears. If surrendering her freedom kept Rowan breathing, she would do it. A deep vibration rumbled through the dirt. It traveled up her boots, settling heavily in her chest. The air grew thick, smelling faintly of static and approaching snow. At the tree line, the grey fog began to part. A massive figure stepped out of the mist. He moved without making a sound. Dark furs draped over broad shoulders. This was him, Alpha Thorne. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sharp pine and charred wood. His heavy boots stopped inches from the cage. A dark hood covered his face, but his eyes were visible in the gloom. Cold, predatory gold. Neither of them moved. A slow exhale plumed from his lips, misting the cold iron between them.
Fear usually smelled like sour sweat. Hers didn't. Thorne stood outside the rusted cage, studying the woman shivering inside. The freezing temperature meant nothing to him. The creeping irritation in his chest was a different story. He caught a trace of crushed winter berries mixed with something sharp and defensive. It demanded his attention, and he despised distractions. Leather creaked as he crossed his arms. He took in the ragged clothing and her trembling limbs. Now she looked like the winter storm could snap her in half. Still, she kept her chin up. Her dark eyes held genuine terror, but she didn't look away. She gripped the rusted bars tight. No tears. People usually broke when he stood this close. He expected weeping. Snow crunched under his boots as he stepped closer. He pulled a thick roll of parchment from his coat. A long dagger followed. "You sent the message." His voice was a low, rough rasp. She gave a single nod. "You understand the terms." He didn't ask. He stated it. "My generals demand an heir to secure the southern ridge. You will provide it." "Your brother vanishes into my keep," Thorne continued. "Fed, shielded from Garrick. But you forfeit all claims. No mark, no affection. We deal in blood, not sentiment. Understood?" He waited for her to hesitate. If she shattered, He could just file her away as another fragile refugee. She didn't. Tessa shoved her battered hand and straight through the gaps in the iron. Thorne unrolled the stiff parchment against the cage. He pressed the bone handle of the dagger into her open palm. Her cold fingers grazed his leather glove. A sudden, sharp jolt shot up his arm. He ignored it. She looked at the paper, then up at his face. "Business," she said softly. She flipped the dagger and dragged the blade across her left palm. Blood welled up, bright and warm. The sharp smell of copper hit the cold air. Like a hard, possessive instinct kicked against his ribs. He pushed it down. Tessa slapped her wet palm onto the bottom of the parchment. The blood soaked into the heavy paper. Thorne took the contract and rolled it tight. He unhooked an iron key from his belt and shoved it into the padlock. "Come." The door groaned as he pulled it open. Tessa stepped out of the cage and onto his soil. She was his property now. A calculated transaction. So why did his chest feel so uncomfortably tight? A low, unguttural blast tore through the quiet. Then a second, a third. Thorne snapped his head toward the southern tree line. War horns. Garrick. His hand dropped to the hilt of his sword. He looked at the bleeding woman beside him, grabbed her uninjured arm, and pulled her close. "Run."
The ride up the mountain had been a blur of freezing wind and the jarring rhythm of hooves. Tessa's muscles locked in rigid exhaustion. By the time they reached the snow-locked keep, it was pitch black. The fortress was a massive block of dark stone jutting into the sky. The air here smelled different: oiled steel, old copper, charred pine. Tessa stood perfectly still in the center of the cavernous bedchamber. Bare grey stone walls threw back the meagre heat of a dying fire in the rusted hearth. There were no tapestries to soften the draught. She pressed her bruised forearms against her ribs. She had survived the wasteland. She had survived the cage. But this silent, suffocating cold felt lethal. She kept her jaw clamped shut. A breeder didn't speak. Weakness usually earned the back of a hand. Her eyes tracked the room. One massive bed dominated the space, carved from dark timber and piled high with heavy pelts. Her stomach knotted. This was his personal sanctuary. Bargains like her belonged in the damp cells below the stronghold. Heavy iron hinges ground open. Tessa went completely still. She pivoted, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. Thorne filled the archway. He had to dip his broad shoulders to clear the stone frame. The leather armor was gone, replaced by a simple black tunic. The air in the room felt suddenly thinner. He didn't speak. His amber eyes locked onto her. The weight of his stare forced her to look down at the cracked stone floor. She wrapped her arms around her waist, fighting a new wave of tremors. Hard boots struck the floorboards. Slow, deliberate, acid burned the back of her throat. Memory flared. A different Alpha, a dark corner, the crack of leather on skin. She locked her knees. She closed her eyes. She waited for the hit. It didn't come. A sudden heavy weight settled over her shoulders. Tessa gasped, her eyes snapping open. Thorne had taken his heavy black mantle from his own back and draped it over her. Coarse fur brushed her cold cheek. The thick pelt smelled of him, crushed pine needles and a dangerous crackling heat. It was suffocatingly warm. He adjusted the collar, pulling the edges together at her throat. His rough knuckles dragged across the bruised skin of her bare collarbone. A sharp jolt of static shot through her nerves. She flinched, shrinking back. Her spine braced for him to snap at her. Thorne went rigid. His hand hovered in the freezing air. A heavy muscle ticked along his jawline. When she finally looked up at his face, there was no fury, just a dark, fractured confusion. like he was watching an animal back away from a warm fire. His hand dropped to his side. "Take the bed." His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Tessa looked from the massive mattress back to him. "Where will you rest?" "I don't sleep." He turned his back to her, walking toward the heavy timber door. He didn't cross the threshold. Instead, his hand clamped over the iron deadbolt. He slammed it home with a metallic crack. He leaned his broad back against the locked wood. The dying firelight caught the scars on his face. The lock was set. He was trapped inside with her.
The long night finally ended, washing the fortress in pale morning light. Thorne sat at the head of the long timber table. A plate of roasted marrow and heavy grain sat untouched in front of him. His focus was locked on the far end of the room. Tessa looked like she was drowning in his black mantle. Dark bruises stained the skin under her eyes. A tight knot formed in Thorne's gut. He couldn't afford empathy. Logic kept the border secure. Logic kept his warriors alive. He remembered his father weeping over a grave, so blinded by grief he missed the enemy vanguard marching on their flank. Caring was a severed artery. Tessa was an asset, a contract, nothing more. Yet his eyes kept dropping to the pale skin of her collarbone, exactly where his knuckles had brushed her the night before. A low territorial instinct rumbled in his chest. Thorne dug his fingers into the scarred table, forcing it down. He watched her carefully. She had a meager iron plate in front of her, a boiled egg, a slice of cheese, a hard heel of bread. She didn't eat. Her raw hands picked up the hardened bread. She scanned the corners of the dining hall, completely avoiding his gaze. Then, with lightning-fast precision, she shoved the dry crust up the long sleeve of her tunic. Thorne's eyes narrowed. She did the same with the cheese, wrapping it in a scrap of linen and burying it deep in her pocket. Her empty stomach gave a hollow, a painful growl. She ignored it. The realization hit him hard. She was hoarding scraps, starving herself to smuggle calories down to the cells for her blind brother. Anger spiked hot and fast in his blood. Not pity. Violence. He thought of Garrick. A regime so feral, it forced a woman to hollow out her own bones just to keep a child fed. How many times had she taken a beating for a stolen crust of bread? Before she could reach for the egg, Thorne stood up. His heavy chair screeched against the stone floor. Tessa froze. Raw panic flared in her eyes as he closed the distance between them. He stopped right beside her chair, looking from her empty plate to her bulging sleeve. Tessa cowered. She folded her arms tight across her chest to guard the stolen food. "I'm sorry." The words scraped out of her. "I wasn't hungry. Quiet." Tessa clamped her mouth shut and squeezed her eyes tightly, bracing for the hit. Thorne reached across the table and grabbed his own overflowing plate. Steaming cuts of boar, spiced grain, and roasted fruit. He slammed the massive platter down directly in front of her. Tessa jerked back. Her eyes flew open, staring at the mountain of food in shock. "Eat." She looked up at him. "This is your portion. Eat it." He crowded her space. "An asset must maintain strength. I won't have you scavenging my territory like a rat." He held her gaze, refusing to let her look away. "Your brother," he lowered his voice to a rough rasp, "has been fed. 2 bowls of oats and dark honey. You don't need to starve to keep him breathing. Do you understand?" The great hall went dead silent. Tessa stared up at the towering warlord. A single tear broke free, tracking slowly down her pale cheek. It was the first time her armor had cracked. A sharp ache twisted behind Thorne's ribs. Her trembling fingers reached out and tore off a piece of the warm bread. Relief rushed through his bloodstream. His thumb twitched. He wanted to step closer. He wanted to wipe the wetness from her face. The heavy double doors of the hall exploded open. Wood splintered against stone. A border scout staggered into the room. His armor was caked in mud and dark, wet blood. He took 3 uneven steps before his knees gave out. He crashed onto the floor, gasping for air. "Sovereign!" the scout choked out, coughing blood onto the stone, or the southern ridge. Thorne snapped his attention to the scout. The tightness in his chest vanished, replaced by absolute ice. The warlord was back. The scout convulsed on the floor. "Garrick, he isn't retreating. He's calling down the coalition."
The quiet of the dining hall didn't last. By midday, Tessa was back out in the courtyard. The snow-locked keep was loud, chaotic, and freezing. Warriors dragged whetstones down iron blades. Heavy carts rattled over the hard earth. Midday sun glared off the compacted snow. Tessa kept her chin tucked, letting her dark hair shield her face. She felt the hostile eyes tracking her, but she ignored them. Invisible meant safe. She hauled a heavy oak bucket of well water against her hip. The rough wood scraped her bare palms. The wind cut straight through her thin linen tunic. A harsh laugh broke through the noise of the yard. Tessa stopped. A group of visiting southern diplomats crowded the stone water trough. They smelled like sour wine and unwashed leather. One of them, a man with pale, greasy hair, stepped directly into her path. "Look what the war beast dragged into the mud." Tessa shifted her weight. Freezing water sloshed over her bruised knuckles. "Just step aside," she said quietly. The man closed the gap, his steel-capped boots hitting the cobblestones. "He insults the coalition by dragging a stray dog into his bed," the diplomat said, pitching his voice loud enough for the yard to hear. "Tell me, little rat, what makes you so special? No pack, no mark, just a bought breeder." Bought breeder. Garrick's word. Tessa swallowed the copper taste in her mouth. She looked down at the slush. "Move." The diplomat smiled. He raised his steel-toed boot and drove it straight into the oak bucket. The wood cracked like a whip. The bucket violently ripped from her cold fingers. Gallons of freezing water hit her legs, and the bitter wind instantly froze the wet linen to her skin. She hit the ground hard. Ice shards tore the skin of her palms. Ugly laughter bounced off the stone walls. "Clean it up, breeder." Tessa stayed on her knees. Her shoulders shook violently from the cold, but she didn't make a sound. She just started picking the jagged wood splinters out of the bloody slush. Then the laughter stopped. The sound of grinding steel died. The war horses ceased their stomping. The air in the courtyard suddenly felt suffocatingly dense, carrying the scent of charred pine and ozone. Tessa looked up through her wet hair. Thorne stood at the top of the keep's stone steps, his dark tunic pulled tight across his chest. His amber eyes were locked dead onto the southern diplomat. Hardened mercenaries scrambled backward to clear his path. The color completely drained from the diplomat's face. "Sovereign," he stammered, raising his hands. "I was just—" Thorne crossed the courtyard in seconds. He stopped right in front of the man. His hand shot out, his thick fingers clamping entirely around the diplomat's throat. Thorne lifted the armored man completely off the ground. Steel-toed boots kicked frantically at the empty air. "How you bring your filth onto my soil?" Thorne's voice was a rough, quiet gravel. "You disrespect what is mine." The diplomat clawed desperately at Thorne's wrist. His face turned a bruised purple. Tessa watched from the ice, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thorne locked his jaw. He squeezed. Cartilage popped. A wet, sickening crack echoed across the dead, silent courtyard. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic wheezing of the suspended southerner.
Thorne left the blinding snow of the courtyard and stepped into the dark iron shadows of the armory. He paced the stone floor, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He wanted to go back out there. He wanted to rip the diplomat's head entirely off his shoulders. He snatched a broadsword from the rack. He grabbed a heavy gray whetstone and dragged it hard down the steel. Metal shrieked. The violent sound barely covered the rushing of blood in his ears. He had almost started a war over spilled water. Carrying was a fatal liability. He knew this. Then that arrogant maggot had kicked ice onto Tessa. Watching her hit the frozen mud without making a sound had obliterated his control. Every mercenary in the fortress now knew the apex sovereign had a vulnerability. Heavy hinges groaned. Thorne froze. The sharp scent of tart fruit hit the air. Tessa slipped through the heavy doors. She had changed out of the soaked rags and was wearing an oversized woolen tunic. Her hands twisted together in front of her. "Sovereign," she said quietly. Thorne turned slowly. He gripped the sword hilt and the whetstone tightly, physically stopping himself from walking over to her. "I ordered you confined to the upper chambers," he barked. She didn't step back. Instead, she took a slow step forward. "I know. But I needed to look you in the eye and acknowledge what you did out there. I was enforcing my borders." He kept his voice rigid. Letting a southern cur disrespect an asset of this keep project's weakness. He was desperately trying to force the interaction back into a business transaction. Then she stepped into the orange light of the wall sconce. A red, swelling cut marked the delicate skin of her cheekbone, the splintering oak bucket. Thorne dropped the broadsword. It clattered loudly against the wooden bench. He crossed the stone floor in 2 strides, stopping inches from her boots. Tessa looked up at him. He slowly raised his hand. His fingers trembled slightly. He commanded an army, yet he was terrified of bruising her skin. He placed his rough thumb just below the cut, barely brushing her cheek. "Did his hands touch you?" His voice was flat, lethal. Tessa gave a tiny shake of her head. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned a fraction of an inch into his palm. "No," she whispered. "The ice cut me." His gaze dropped to her mouth. He could see the rapid pulse beating at the base of her throat. He wanted to pull her against his chest and bury his face in her hair. He stepped back instead. "Tessa," he rasped. Her eyes fluttered shut. She let out a soft, shuddering sigh. A sharp crack echoed off the stone wall. Tessa flinched, her eyes snapping open. She looked at his left hand. Thorne followed her gaze, or he had forgotten he was still holding the dense whetstone. Under the sheer pressure of his grip, the solid gray rock had shattered. Stone dust drifted to the floor, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the sound of their breathing.
It took hours for the tension of the armory to fade. By midnight, the keep was silent. Tessa knelt on a coarse rug before the main hearth. She dipped a linen scrap into a bowl of steaming water, the sound of the liquid lapping against the wood. The room smelled of roasted pine and the sharp scent of charred timber from the glowing embers. Rowan sat on a low stool in front of her. His thin legs kicked an anxious rhythm. He'd taken a fall on the stone stairs earlier, leaving an angry red gash across his shin. She pressed her palm against his calf to steady him. "Hold still, sweet boy." She pressed the warm linen to the cut. Rowan sucked in a sharp breath, his fingernails digging into the edge of his stool. "It stings, Tess." She leaned in, blowing a soft, cooling breath over the wound. "I know. We have to get the dirt out so the bad magic doesn't take root. Do you remember the story of the careless hound?" Rowan gave a slow nod, his clouded eyes reflecting the orange light of the fire. Outside, a brutal gale slammed against the windows, rattling the glass in its iron frame. Rowan flinched. Tessa ignored her own exhaustion, scrubbing away the dried mud and the echo of the southern diplomat's laughter. "Tell me the story again," Rowan whispered. "Please?" Tessa sat back on her heels, keeping her hand on his leg. "Long ago, there was a little wolf who lived in a valley of shadows," she began, her voice dropping to a low hum. "He was small and wobbly, but he found out a secret. He realized the monsters in the dark were just lonely shadows looking for a warm fire." The air in the room suddenly changed. It grew thick and heavy, with the scent of winter ozone. Tessa's lungs seized. She didn't need to look up to know who was there. Thorne was leaning against the stone archway. He was perfectly still. The leather armor was gone, replaced by a dark tunic that showed the heavy, cold-corded muscle of his chest. The firelight caught the scars along his jaw. His golden eyes were unblinking, focused entirely on her face. There was no rage in him now. Looking at him, Tessa didn't see a warlord. She saw a man who had spent 10 years locking his heart in a vault of steel. He stood there like a man drowning in a sea of his own isolation. Her fingers went slack against the wet linen. She stayed on her knees, her breath hitching as she looked at the man who owned her blood. Thorne pushed off the stone pillar. He took one heavy stride out of the shadows and into the heat of the fire.
Thorne felt a crushing weight on his chest. He had stood in the darkness of the archway for an hour. His inner wolf was restless, still snarling from the events in the armory. Logic told him to go. He should be on the battlements, counting guards, and preparing for the coming war. Instead, the sound of Tessa's voice had pulled his boots to the hearth. He couldn't stop watching her hands. She moved with a tenderness he hadn't seen since he was a child. Seeing that devotion in a world that tried to crush her every day sparked a hot, protective anger in his gut. He wanted to break the world for her. He wanted to kill Garrick for what he'd called her. He took another step into the light. The floorboards didn't make a sound under his weight. Tessa let the linen slip into the water bowl. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just watched him, seeing the fractures he tried so hard to hide. Thorne stopped at the edge of the rug. He towered over her, his shadow covering her completely. "Alpha," she breathed. It wasn't a title of rank. It was a plea. Thorne dropped to one knee. He forced himself to be level with her, a sovereign submitting to his own asset. The air between them tasted like static. He raised a scarred hand, his knuckles still dusty from the stone he'd crushed. He stopped an inch from her face. His jaw locked. His entire body ached with the need to touch her. "You asked me where I slept," Thorne said, his voice a dark, tectonic murmur. Tessa gave a small, trembling nod. "I told you I don't sleep. That was the truth." He locked his eyes on her lips. "For 10 winters, this keep has been a tomb. I built these walls to keep out the cold. I fortified them to kill any weakness." He fought the urge to pull back, to be the unfeeling stone he was meant to be. "But then you crossed the threshold," he whispered. "You gave me your blood. And since that cage locked behind you, and this fortress hasn't had a spark of warmth until you sat by this fire." A single tear rolled down Tessa's cheek. Thorne moved his thumb to wipe it away. He was ready to break every rule he had. A small, warm hand intercepted his movement. Thorne went rigid. Rowan had reached out. The blind boy's fingers moved through the air until they wrapped around Thorne's massive fist. Rowan didn't pull back. He just held Thorne's thumb in his small palm. "You're the giant," the boy said softly. "The one from her story? The shadow looking for a fire?" Thorne stopped breathing. It had been a decade since a human hand had touched him without a weapon. He looked at the boy's tiny fingers, then back at Tessa. She was staring at them, her eyes wide with shock. For a second, the three of them were the only things left in the world. The vault was gone. Then, the silence broke. Booted feet sprinted down the stone corridor. Fast, desperate. Thorne's head snapped toward the door. His eyes flared gold. The warlord was back in an instant. "Sovereign!" a voice screamed from the hall. High above them, the massive iron warning bells began to ring, a deafening, rhythmic clatter that shook the stones. The coalition was at the gates. The quiet warmth of the fireside was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of panic at the back of Thorne's throat. The air in the war room was stifling. Fists pounded against the edge of the carved oak map table, rattling the wooden tactical markers. Garrick's vanguard was refusing to retreat. They were digging trenches directly into the southern frost. The shouting of his generals dissolved into white noise. Thorne stared down at his own scarred knuckles, but the ghost of a child's fragile grip still warmed his skin. He blinked, but the image wouldn't fade. Tessa, her jawline damp with a single tear. He took a slow, deliberate breath. He had spent 10 brutal winters building a fortress of iron and logic around his mind. Walls designed to deflect enemies and bury his own ruin. Yet a shivering refugee had bypassed every lock with a quiet exhale and a damp cloth. It terrified him. His father had died because he went soft, a sovereign who abandoned the western watchtower to pick winter flowers for a mate, leaving half the stronghold to be slaughtered in their sleep. Affection pulverized empires. He had to slam the iron vault shut right now. "Alpha." Kyle's voice cut through the noise. Thorne looked up. The old general leaned over the map table, a jagged silver scar catching the candlelight. "Garrick is using the coalition laws," Kyle said, snatching up a wooden marker. "He's claiming theft of property, or rallying the other 5 territories as we speak." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Let them try. The borders will hold." Kale slammed the marker down. "Not if the entire coalition marches. We can't bleed out over one stray southerner." The general lowered his voice, dropping it to a lethal murmur. "The barracks are talking, Sovereign. They say you're losing your mind over the bot breeder." The filthy label hung in the air. The urge to vault the table and crush Kale's windpipe was a living, a feral thing in Thorne's chest. She is a queen, not cattle. He forced his hands flat against the cold oak. He focused on the rough grain of the wood. "Breathe in. Command the room." "Watch your throat, Kale," Thorne murmured. Kale dragged a dagger across the parchment, carving a line south. "I watch my duty. The treaty requires signatures at dawn. You ride with her, you show her favor, and the coalition breaks. Is she worth the blood of our vanguard?" A cold weight settled in Thorne's gut. On the secret clause. Unmarked assets returned by force. He had to shut this down before the rumors fractured his army. He needed ice. "You overstep." Thorne's voice dropped, flat and dead. "I don't bleed for women. I kill for territory. She's an asset." Kale's eyes narrowed. "An asset?" "She bled on my parchment. The bloodline needs a vessel." The lie coated his tongue in ash. "It's a transaction. She means absolutely nothing to me beyond her utility." He pushed off the heavy oak table. "I won't sacrifice the stronghold for a temporary breeder. Let Garrick posture." A sudden draft swept into the room, guttering the candles. Thorne looked up. The heavy iron doors stood open. Tessa anchored the threshold. Fresh linen bandages rested in her hands. Her dark eyes were locked on his face. Her expression was completely blank. The blood rushed from Thorne's head. Tessa offered a slow, shallow bow of her chin. Then she turned, vanishing into the dark corridor.
Tessa took the stone stairs 2 at a time, fleeing the war room until she hit the open air. The wind on the high battlements was brutal. It carried the sharp scent of crushed pine and incoming snow. She grabbed the rusted iron railing, letting the freezing metal bite into her bare hands until her knuckles turned white. Below her, the black peaks stretched out forever. She closed her eyes. A transaction. She means absolutely nothing. The words rang in her ears. She had let her guard down, and sitting by that fire, staring into his eyes, she had actually believed the sovereign had a soul. She had lowered her shield for a fraction of a second, and he had gutted her. A memory from the southern pits surfaced. A wild mare locked in a pitch-black box for weeks until she forgot the sky. When they finally let her out, the horse didn't fight the heavy leather saddle. She just stood there, empty, broken. Tessa knew the feeling. The sovereign had just slammed the lid shut. She wouldn't weep. She wouldn't break. She would simply wear the saddle. Heavy boot steps vibrated through the stone walkway, measured and slow. Thorne stopped right behind her. His massive heat radiated against the freezing air, crowding her shoulders. "It's freezing up here." His voice scraped against the wind. The cold authority from the war room was gone. He sounded tired. "Go back to the fire." Tessa stared at the grey sky. She gathered up the pieces of her pride and locked them away. I am acclimatizing to the north, Sovereign." Her voice was entirely flat, hollow. A sharp breath hitched in his chest. "Tessa." A boot scraped stone as he stepped closer. She turned, stepping back to keep a strict 3 feet of distance between them. She clasped her hands neatly at her waist and lowered her chin. "Do you have a task for me, Sovereign?" she asked, her tone razor-sharp and polite. "The rations are tallied. I can inventory the armory. As your asset, I need to provide utility." Thorne froze. His eyes went wide, flashing with raw panic. "Don't!" His voice cracked. "Don't speak to me like that. I am following the terms of the parchment." She kept her face perfectly blank. "The vessel must remain compliant. My health is optimal. The transaction proceeds exactly as you told your generals." Thorne reached out, his thick fingers visibly trembling in the cold. "I had to project strength." He stepped into her space, his whisper harsh and desperate. Kale was challenging the treaty. The vanguard. She took 1 step back, out of his reach. "You don't owe an asset an explanation." She offered a polite, empty smile. "I understand my place. I won't distract you from your war." He stared at her, completely devastated. She had won the battlefield just by refusing to care. "Tessa, please." Iron warning bells detonated in the tower above them. Clang, clang, clang. Thorne whipped his head toward the northern valley. The vulnerability vanished from his face, instantly replaced by cold calculation. Down in the valley, a line of armored mercenaries carved through the deep snow. Black banners snapped in the wind. The coalition escort for the Sunstice Summit was here. Time was up. They were marching into a diplomatic slaughterhouse, and Tessa was walking in completely exposed. The warning bells faded into the roar of the summit. Thousands of mercenaries were packed beneath a single massive canvas roof. The air was thick. It smelled of roasting marrow, spilled ale, and sweat. Tessa kept her back pressed hard against a heavy crimson tapestry at the very edge of the pavilion. She gripped a silver chalice in both hands. The metal was freezing. She let the cold bite into her palms, using the sharp sting to stay grounded. Territorial laughter erupted from the nearby tables, vibrating against her ribs. Heavy drinking horns slammed against oak. Through the flickering torchlight, she watched the high table. Thorne sat at the absolute center, flanked by the coalition warlords. He was rigid, unmoving. He didn't look at her, not even a glance. He had drawn the boundary lines back on the battlements, and she was staying firmly behind them. She was an asset. Assets stayed in the shadows. And Tessa stared down at the splintered floorboards and took a slow sip of the metallic water. She knew how to survive a pit of predators. When a rabbit is trapped, it doesn't run. It stops moving. She held her breath. But something was wrong. An hour ago, the northern guards near the outer flap had shifted out of formation. A shadow had slipped behind the guest quarters. A sudden gust of wind snapped the canvas above her. It carried a new scent. Not the sharp ozone and pine of the north. This was sour sweat. Old blood, rotting earth. Tessa stopped breathing. You clean up well for a stray mutt. The wet whisper scraped directly against her ear. She spun, her shoulders hitting the tapestry hard. Garrick. He stepped flush against her, his heavy boots blocking her only exit. The stench of stale garlic washed over her face. Garrick. The name tasted like ash. Did you really think you could run? He leaned in close. Did you calculate that hiding under the war beast's furs would wipe out your debt? Tessa's fingers tightened around the chalice. The urge to scream burned in her throat. If she screamed, Thorne would kill him. If Thorne killed a coalition alpha here, under the summit banner, it meant war. Thousands of northerners would die. She bit down on her own tongue. The sharp taste of copper flooded her mouth. She swallowed the scream. I belong to the northern ice now. She tilted her chin up, eye meeting his jaundiced eyes. I signed a blood contract. A wet chuckle rattled in his chest. A piece of paper doesn't stop an army, Tessa. Coalition law is absolute. Unmarked property goes back to its owner. His calloused finger dragged roughly across the bare skin of her collarbone. She flinched. The silver chalice slipped from her hands. It clattered uselessly against the floorboards, the sound completely drowned out by the drums. Garrick pinned her against the thick fabric with his weight. Thorne is playing politics. His whisper dropped to a hiss. My vanguard is already inside his walls. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. No. The words slipped out. Garrick pressed his mouth to her ear. My trackers bypassed the perimeter an hour ago, he murmured. They are standing right outside your blind brother's tent. Make a sound, and they'll cut his throat before you hit the floor.
The air at the high table was stifling. Thorne sat in the carved oak throne. To his left and right, the 5 coalition warlords barked over trade routes and demanded tariffs on winter grain. Their voices scraped against his skull. He kept his hands flat on the table. Right between his wrists sat the coalition treaty. Heavy yellow parchment, dark ink, crimson wax seals. To secure the peace, he just had to pick up the silver quill, sign his name, and smile. The ink blurred. His chest felt too tight. He had spent the entire evening ignoring her. He had played the cold, untouched sovereign perfectly. He had starved himself of looking at her just to prove to Kale, and to himself, that she was merely an asset. It was a lie. Thorne looked up from the parchment. He scanned the crowded floor below, past the mercenaries, past the roaring fires. He found her at the absolute edge of the room, pressed into the crimson tapestries. His heart stopped. A Garrick was towering over her. The Southern Alpha had her physically pinned against the canvas. Thorne's vision tunneled. He watched the silver cup drop from her hands. He saw Garrick's dirty fingers drag across her bare collarbone. Tessa's spine was locked in rigid terror. She was completely trapped. But she wasn't screaming. She is staying quiet to protect the peace. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She is letting a monster touch her to prevent my war. When the iron walls in Thorne's mind shattered, diplomacy evaporated. The sovereign died. Only the war beast remained. Sovereign? Kael extended the silver quill. The coalition waits. Sign it. Thorne stared at the yellow parchment. It was the very law that gave Garrick the right to drag her back to the fighting pits. He wouldn't let her go. He wouldn't trade her for a crown. He grabbed both edges of the treaty. Sovereign. Kael's eyes went wide. Thorne ripped the heavy parchment in half. The tearing sound cracked like a whip over the high table. The warlords froze, their jaws snapping shut. The scent of broken wax hit the air. Before Kael could speak, Thorne shoved his oak throne backward. It crashed onto the stone. He didn't take the stairs. The giant vaulted the high table. He dropped 10 feet, his black mantle snapping in the draft, and hit the wooden floorboards with an earth-shattering crack. The dancers stopped. The music died. Thousands of mercenaries turned in dead silence, watching the war beast rise to his full height. His eyes were locked on the darkest corner of the room. The dust from the splintered floorboards settled slowly over Thorne's steel-capped boots. He had just dropped 10 feet from the high table, and the impact left the entire pavilion in dead silence. Thousands of mercenaries stopped moving. He had broken the most sacred law of the summit. There was no going back. He turned his head. Someone dropped a cup in the distance. The sour smell of spilled wine hit the air. Thorne ignored it. He locked his eyes on the darkest corner of the tent and started walking. The crowd scrambled. Hardened warriors shoved each other out of the way, splintering oak chairs in their rush to clear his path. The treaty didn't matter. The crown didn't matter. Only the sight of Garrick pressing his sweating weight against Tessa. Take your hands off her. The command was low, but it hit the heavy canvas like a battering ram. Garrick flinched and dropped his grip. He puffed out his chest. Oh, but his yellow eyes were wide. His trembling fingers dug into his leather cuirass, pulling out a crumpled roll of parchment. The blood contract. She's mine. Garrick waved the stained paper. His voice cracked. The law is absolute. She has no mark. She is nothing but the bought breeder. The filthy label hung in the air. Thorne closed the final 10 feet. He stepped entirely between Tessa and the Southerner, blocking her from the room, when the heat coming off his back was a physical wall against the draft. You want to debate paper? Thorne asked. His voice rumbled deep in his chest. His hand shot out. He snatched the contract right from Garrick's fingers. Garrick stumbled backward over his own boots. You can't break the peace. The coalition will burn your stronghold. Thorne looked down at the ancient parchment. He didn't tear it. He just closed his fist. The thick paper crumpled with a sharp, dry crunch. And he dropped the ruined knot into a puddle of spilled wine on the floorboards. Let them burn. Garrick's sneer vanished. He realized Thorne wasn't negotiating. He was preparing to kill. Garrick threw his hand up. The heavy canvas at the back of the tent ripped open. 20 elite southern mercenaries flooded in from the cold. Steel-cleared leather in perfect, terrifying unison. A ring of sharp iron closed in around Thorne and Tessa.
The sharp scent of copper flooded the air. Tessa stood at the dead center of a contracting iron ring. 20 blades pointed directly at Thorne's back. The blood pounded in her ears. She had swallowed her pride to stop this exact massacre, and he had thrown his empire away for her anyway. She looked at his hands. He hadn't drawn his broadsword. He hadn't called for his missing vanguard. His hands hung empty at his sides. Garrick let out a rough bark of laughter from behind his mercenary shield. "Ha, you fool!" Garrick spat, dragging a spiked broadsword from his hip. "You march with empty hands. I'll take the vessel, and I'll take your head." "No." The word tore from Tessa's throat. She lunged forward, grabbing the dark fabric of Thorne's tunic. She tried to drag him backward, positioning herself to take the first strike. He didn't move a single inch. He felt like a pillar of forged iron. Slowly, Thorne reached back. His large, calloused fingers wrapped around her freezing wrist. The pressure was gentle, grounding, a quiet, physical promise in the middle of a war zone. He let go of her skin. "Close your eyes, Tessa." His voice didn't sound human anymore. It was a deep, grating rumble that vibrated the oak floorboards. Garrick screamed a battle command and lunged, driving his broadsword straight for Thorne's exposed throat. Thorne didn't reach for a weapon. With a sickening sound of popping joints and tearing fabric, Thorne's massive silhouette exploded outward. The giant vanished. In his place stood a towering nightmare of midnight fur and muscle. The black wolf was twice the size of a natural shifter. Lethal talons gouged deep into the floorboards, kicking up dry splinters. The torchlight reflected in his apocalyptic yellow eyes. Panic ripped through the southern vanguard. Mercenaries tripped backward. Their swords shook in their hands. They had never seen a shift driven by pure, possessive rage. Garrick's battle cry turned into a wet scream. He dug his boots into the wood, trying to stop his charge. He wrenched his sword up to shield his chest. It was too late. The colossal black wolf launched through the air. He didn't even try to dodge the blade. He hit Garrick like a falling boulder. The spiked broadsword flew from the southerner's grip, clattering away into the shadows. Tessa watched the massive shadow pin Garrick to the splintered oak. Garrick threw his arm over his face in a desperate block. The massive jaws clamped directly over Garrick's forearm. Thick bones snapped in half. Arterial blood sprayed the floorboards in a heavy, wet arc. The sickening crunch was followed by a sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the drip of crimson hitting the wood.
The wet snap of Garrick's radius bone echoed through the pavilion. The southern alpha let out a high, agonizing wail. Thorne's massive jaws remained locked. The bitter metallic taste of arterial blood coated his tongue. Garrick had put his hands on her. He had to be dismantled. The 20 southern assassins panicked. They lunged, thrusting their drawn steel at the towering black wolf in a desperate, uncoordinated strike. Thorne released Garrick's shattered arm. He spun. His massive talons swiped through the air. Steel armor folded like tin. He batted 3 fully armored mercenaries across the room. They smashed into the heavy oak feasting tables, sending splinters flying into the crowd. Thorne dropped his head and unleashed a chest-rattling roar. The sound vibrated the floorboards. The remaining assassins broke. They dropped their broadswords, abandoned their bleeding alpha, and scrambled over each other to claw their way out of the tent. Thorne stood in the wreckage, his chest heaving. A jagged spike of panic hit his brain. Where was the northern vanguard? Were Garrick's trackers already at the lower camps? He thought of Rowan, blind and defenseless in the dark. He needed to finish this and hunt the trackers down. He whipped his blood-soaked muzzle back to Garrick. The southern warlord was sobbing into the splintered oak, clutching his ruined arm. A heavy leather cord hung around his neck, strung with jagged or yellowed wolf teeth, trophies from the fighting pits. Thorne stepped forward and planted his massive paw directly onto Garrick's sternum. The weight pinned the coward to the floorboards. Thorne lowered his head. The heat coming off his midnight pelt forced Garrick to squeeze his eyes shut. Thorne opened his jaws. He bypassed the exposed jugular. Death was too quick a mercy. He wanted Garrick to live with the humiliation, and razor teeth clamped precisely onto the thick leather cord of the trophy necklace. With a single, violent upward jerk, Thorne ripped the cord from Garrick's throat. The leather snapped. The stolen teeth scattered across the blood-slicked oak like dropped coins. Then, silence. The deafening chaos vanished, leaving a heavy, ringing vacuum. Behind the overturned high table, the coalition warlords stood frozen. Thousands of mercenaries held their breath, staring at the impossible mass of the Black Wolf standing over the ruined southern Alpha. The message was clear. The treaty was dead. She belonged to the North. Thorne slowly lifted his paw off Garrick's chest. The sobbing warlord scrambled backward into the shadows, dragging his bleeding arm. Hot, dark blood dripped from Thorne's jaw onto the wood. He pulled in a deep, ragged breath. He turned his massive head. He ignored the terrified coalition. He ignored the ruined tables. His burning focus locked entirely onto the woman standing by the crimson tapestry.
Tessa kept her back, pressed to the heavy fabric. The pavilion was dead silent. The towering black wolf was walking directly toward her. Thick fur bristled along his spine. His muzzle was stained with fresh, violent red. She wasn't afraid. He had torn up a peace treaty for her. He had ripped apart a mercenary vanguard to keep her safe. The numbness that had kept her alive for a decade finally cracked. The wolf took a slow, deliberate step. His talons clicked heavily over the splintered oak and broken glass. The crowd of hardened mercenaries parted, not daring to breathe. He stopped exactly 3 feet from her boots. The shadows seemed to pull inward. A brutal wet snap of shifting bone echoed in the quiet tent. The wolf vanished. Alpha Thorne stood in his place. His dark tunic was shredded. His broad chest heaved, slick with sweat and dusted with Garrick's blood. Their eyes met. The lethal, predatory rage was gone, replaced by raw, agonizing hesitation. He was bracing himself, waiting for her to flinch away from the monster. Tessa stepped forward. She didn't kneel. She didn't look away. She closed the distance. She lifted her trembling hands and pressed her palms flat against his bare, scorching chest. She felt the heavy, frantic hammering of his heart beneath her fingers. The sovereign shattered. A ragged breath tore from his throat. His heavy arms wrapped around her waist, hauling her flush against him. He lifted her boots off the floorboards and buried his face in the curve of her neck. Kyle secured the perimeter, he rasped, his voice raw against her skin. The vanguard intercepted Garrick's trackers outside the tents. Rowan is safe. The panic in Tessa's chest dissolved. The Northern Guard had held the line. Her brother was okay. A heavy sob broke past her lips. She wrapped her arms around his thick neck, twisting her fingers deep into his dark hair. "I know," she cried, burying her face in his shoulder. Thorne crushed her tighter to him, anchoring her like she was the only solid thing left in the room. "The ink is dead," he rumbled against her pulse point. "You are not an asset. You are my mate." Tessa tilted her chin back. She looked up at his scarred face. "Mark me." It wasn't a question. It was a fierce, grounding command. She exposed the delicate column of her throat to the silent pavilion. A deep rumble started in Thorne's chest, vibrating into her bones. He ignored the watching warlords. He opened his jaw. Sharp canines scraped slowly against her unmarked skin. Tessa gasped, digging her nails into his shoulders. He sank his teeth into her flesh. The sharp bite of pain was instantly swallowed by a rush of pure heat. It flooded her veins, burning away the cold, washing out a decade of survival trauma. A breathless cry broke from her lips. She arched her spine, pressing closer to him. Thorne held her steady. He drew a single drop of blood, sealing the biological claim. Slowly, he pulled back. He ran his rough tongue gently over the puncture, his eyes filled with total worship. Then he turned his head. He kept his arm locked tightly around her waist and leveled a glare over the thousands of mercenaries. He looked at the crumpled, wine-soaked treaty on the floor. She is the sovereign of the North. Thorne's voice boomed like thunder. If a single territory, vanguard, or breath disrespects her, why, I will burn your borders to ash. The pavilion remained perfectly still. From the shadows, General Kyle stepped forward. The hardened veteran looked at the bleeding southern warlord. He looked at the fresh mark on Tessa's throat. Kyle drew his heavy broadsword. He dropped heavily to one knee, driving the steel into the floorboards, and bowed his head. The movement rippled outward. Thousands of hardened mercenaries collapsed to the oak. The deafening clatter of heavy armor echoed through the tent as the entire coalition bowed to the refugee who had tamed the war beast.